Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this public meeting of the Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee. The meeting is being recorded, so could I ask, the first time that you speak, if you could just say who you are, just for the record. Thank you. So welcome to everyone, and apologies for absence. Heather, could you just remind us of any?
Sorry, Chair. We have apologies from Martin Blunden and Mark McAteer.
Okay, thank you very much. And do we have any observers on the call?
We have Lorna Smith from Scottish Government on the call today observing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And well, welcome to those who are observing. Consideration of items to be taken in private. We have in the private section, we have the external audit report and the annual accounts, which are always taken in private at this session because of the need to keep them in that capacity until they're laid before Parliament. Is there anything else that anyone believes that is on the agenda that should appropriately be taken in private session? No. Okay, in that case, we will move on. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest relating to any items on the agenda? No. Okay, well, as normal, if there are any which arise during the course of the meeting, if you could please bring them to my attention. Thank you. And then that takes us into the substantive part of the agenda, and we have two sets of minutes to consider. First of all, the meeting on the 9th of July. Are we content that this is an accurate record of the meeting? I'm not going to go through it page by page, but any observations on the minutes? No. Okay. Are there any matters arising in those minutes that need to be dealt with that are not already covered elsewhere on the agenda? No, this is going swimmingly. Okay, and then we have the second set of minutes from the meeting that we held on the 26th of August. Again, in terms of accuracy, are there any points to be made? No, and similarly, any matters arising that we don't pick up elsewhere on the agenda. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much for that. So that includes on the two sets of minutes that we I agree are an accurate record of the discussion. And then that takes us on to the action log. And Heather, will you just take us through this, please?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Heather Gregg, Board Support Team. As you'll see, this action log has 6 actions, 5 of which are marked blue as completed, and 1 that's marked green as on track for completion. So it's just to confirm the committee are content with the position statement updates for the 5 actions to be removed and the green action to remain open. Thank you.
Okay, do we have agreement to the proposal summarised by Heather? Okay. And that leaves just that one outstanding item around gifts, hospitality and registers of interest, which for good reason needs to be carried forward. Okay, thank you for that.
Chair, sorry, I think David might want to come in. He had his hand up a second ago.
Oh, David?
Sorry, Chair, David Johnson, Risk and Audit Manager. I think at the last one, it was to give consideration and how we can maybe get feedback in terms of the gifts, hospitalities and interest policy. So I've already forwarded to directorates a kind of request just to get feedback on how that was received. So it's been positive in terms of response, but going forward, hopefully after today, in terms of the fraud policy. We'll utilise the policy both for gifts and hospitality and for the fraud policy to go out and engage further with directorates, really to get feedback and to enhance awareness and ownership. So I'm happy to bring back further information as you wish, Chair, but I was hoping that that action would be complete in terms of initial feedback coming back and then coming back maybe later once we've held kind of further meetings with directorates on the fraud and the gifts and hospitality policies.
So are you saying, David, that you've received feedback and to date that feedback has been positive? And
Yes,
if
Chair.
so, what is the scale of that feedback? Is it material?
At this point in time, no, I wouldn't say it's material in terms of all directorates have come back. I think what I'm looking to do rather is actually to engage with them directly, rather than to look for them to come back maybe with a written response, to talk to them directly, both about the fraud policy and about the gifts and hospitality. And again, it's going to be over a period of time. We're starting those meetings end of November, beginning of December, but again, it will be over the period to just increase awareness and ownership of both policies.
Okay, well, I guess from the perspective that you've initiated a process to gather feedback, I would be content for this item to be closed. But at the same time, I'm keen for the committee to understand the effectiveness of these new policies. And as you say, the fraud policy runs alongside this one as well. So if on that basis, is the committee content to close off this item in the knowledge that we will receive subsequent feedbacks on the effectiveness of the new policies?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, well, on that basis, we can, Heather, treat that item as now completed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, David. And when we come on to the item later on in the agenda, I would like to just use the three examples, not the specifics of the three examples, but the circumstances of the three examples as a basis of some sort of discussion on what's happened. So it's just to give you the heads up that I'd like to talk about that.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so that takes us on to the chunk of the agenda on internal audit, and we have the progress report, and we have one final audit report on remote working. And is it Gary? Are you talking to one?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Yes, for the record, I'm Gary Devlin, a partner, an audit partner in Assets Group, and the head of internal audit for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. So the progress report is the report we bring to every audit committee, telling you how well we're doing in implementing the audit plan. We're making good progress in implementing the audit plan. You can see from the table that the remote working audit is complete and it's on your agenda for today. We've also completed the fieldwork for the fire safety enforcement audit, and that's due to come to the January 2022 audit committee. The learning and development audit is in planning, and the other audits are also in planning, and they come to later audit committees. We're also meeting all of the requirements of us, all of the KPI requirements of us in respect of delivery of the audit with our contract. And that's all I have to say, really, Chair. I think that should provide you with good assurance that the audit plan is progressing as you would expect. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Do we have any questions for Gary on the progress report? No. Just one thing, Gary, and it's around KPI number 5, customer satisfaction or customer feedback. I just wanted to ask a question around whether you formally, because I can't remember, formally used feedback questionnaires as part of that process, or is it more an iterative discussion, I think led by David Johnson, collating feedback? I see Matt's nodding. So in that case, Matt, or indeed David, can you give us a sense for the type of feedback that you're getting from auditees? You know, is it significant feedback, or is it like drawing blood out of stone? And either way, what is it they're saying to you?
Thank you, Chair. The feedback's positive. I think the feedback is one that there is an engagement between ourselves and assets. I think there's an opportunity to discuss some of the issues coming forward. There's an opportunity to review some of the paper, some of the information that's coming through. And I think that probably sums it up. I think the level of engagement that I'm hearing from directorates is really good. There will always be areas that we feel we maybe haven't been represented as we would have liked to be. And I think when you then have that discussion, it probably comes back to we needed to provide more information and more assurance to the auditors. And again, by just having that discussion, the next time something comes round, there's a more open dialogue. So I think everything has been really positive. I think it's for us to set realistic timescales. It's for us to give them the right information. But I do believe it's a really positive experience. And that's the feedback that's coming back.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, David. Thank you. That's really encouraging, and much better to collate that qualitative information than simply have a series of filled in tick boxes from auditees. So good. It'd be interesting to hear how that develops as that relationship matures, David, because I think what you're suggesting is there's learning on the part of the organisation how to respond and essentially get the best out of the auditors.
I think it works both ways, yes. I think we're over the first year. I think the first year was probably more challenging because of COVID, because of how we were working. I think as time progresses, we're getting to know each other. That sounds really basic, but I think that for me, that's really important. I think just being able to talk to each other, be quite open, and to make sure we just capture the information in the right way.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Gary.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, Chair. I think that's the right analysis of it, is that we've been learning since we joined SFRS around how the organisation works, and we have changed how we engage with SFRS, both in who we engage with and when we engage, how we interact with the senior leadership team, how we present and clear our reports, how we deal with the feedback and update the operational process for internal audit delivery. And I think all of that's really positive. I think it is good, strong engagement focused on continuous improvement of both the internal audit service and how the management team interact with us. So I just thought I'd give a personal perspective on that.
No, that's really helpful too, and most encouraging, because I mean the organisation will get most from the audit process if there is that level of openness and positivity in that relationship. So really encouraging to hear that. John.
Yeah, just to add to the commentary that's went on already, one of the things that I've certainly benefited from is being able to kind of pick up the phone and have a chat with Matt and engage in the overall process, where we are, try and understand how we can make things better, where there's perhaps issues that we need to resolve. And they have been dealt with very promptly, and we've always found a position where I suppose I see it as a very supportive relationship in terms of assets saying, well, look, have you thought about this? Try X, Y, and Z, or we've got clients that have done this. So we certainly have found additional benefit just by having those conversations around how we could approach something. So I just wanted to feed that back as well, Chair.
No, that's also very helpful, John. Thank you. Okay, before Azet's heads get much bigger, we better move on. So thanks for that. So that takes us on to the final report on remote working, which you will recall that the committee took a fair amount of interest in to just understand the scope of the audit. So particularly keen to hear about it. So is that Matt? Are you going to talk about that?
Yes, that's correct, Chair. I won't dwell on too much the kind of the line by line workings of the report and take it as read that everybody has had the opportunity to look through. In summary, effectively, we're looking at to undertake a focus review of the approach to agile working in the remote setting, and that's laid out with the report, and supplemented within that, we've also undertaken some surveys of staff to get a bit of a feel for how staff have felt about this, in addition to the work that's been done by management as well. And there's a detailed appendix of summary of that work at the back of the report for you to peruse as well. For me, the key thing on this is that ultimately we found the approach to generally be operating well, and as we've seen with a number of organisations that we work with, we're in the position of generally practice is working, but what I would say is that practice is slightly ahead of the documentation of the practice, and that translating into some of the things that are written down within that. I mean, across the piece, as I say, within our clients, we have looked at this kind of area, as I'm sure you'd expect, quite extensively over the last 12 to 18 months. And it's not an uncommon position, and that's why we put these down as a series of yellow grade 2 findings. There isn't anything else that I would particularly want to draw to the committee's attention, because as I say, overall, I think it's a fairly positive report, although there are some things to tidy up, but would very much welcome either comments from management in relation to the report or indeed questions from committee members.
Okay, and before I open that, thanks for that, Matt. Before I open that up, I think Scott Semple, I think, is on the call. As the recipient of this report, Scott, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you received it.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, they're happy to come in with that. I guess maybe by way of context, the audit itself was quite timely for us when it took place. I guess a year and a bit into, if you like, transforming how we operated, which felt kind of almost like it was overnight. But in terms of remote working for us, wasn't something that was as widespread as it is now back in March when the pandemic hit, and then obviously in the back of us launching our Agile Working Framework at the start of August, it was extremely timely. And I think as an organisation, what we're saying is we're still learning and we're still improving and developing our ideas and concepts around this. And so the audit and the report and the recommendations were well received, and as I say, very timely. I think even since then, on the back of our Agile framework launch, we've had staff engagement sessions, 9 in total, 180 staff attending, and even from them, those sessions, some of the feedback there actually ties in with some of the recommendations of the audit, in terms of things we need to be looking at and thinking about by way of that employee experience, whether it be, our flexi time policy, for example, has got a kind of 7 to 7 block on it, and the question will be, well, how does that actually complement agile or remote working? There's other things in there around about terms and conditions and unintended consequences, things like what about working abroad? How easy or difficult is that? But I think importantly too, also through our managers that have engaged with those sessions, recognising this isn't easy. This is a change of environment, and supporting our line managers to manage but also lead in a virtual environment has come through as a thread. So a lot of even some of that early feedback through the sessions lends itself really nicely to the findings of the audit. And I think one thing we're going to be exploring certainly within POD is just in terms of how do we make sure we keep momentum going behind this, and how can we support and enable innovation and ideas to be tried and to be tested. So we're thoughtful and going to be reflecting on that in relation to how we've got an agile working group that was pulled together to develop and implement and launch the framework. The audit itself, I'm actually meeting with them later this afternoon. We're going to talk about this to see how we can progress with the actions and recommendations, and then obviously through the kind of more governance route, find a landing site for the monitoring piece and the recording and lessons learned, and how we can report that in terms of governance, likely at the moment through the people board, but again organisationally still broadening that conversation based on what's being captured within the audit. So from our perspective, very timely, very much welcomed, and it helps us with our journey around about how we've adapted and changed how we organise ourselves going forward. So if that's okay, Chair, I'll maybe just pause with that. I could talk, you might get a sense I could talk for hours on this, but I'll pause there for danger of taking up all the agenda time.
Well, that's fine. I thought we were about to run out of time, but but thanks for that, Scott. And that's some really great observations there, and I really like what you've described, that the organisation is on this journey, you know, and learning as it goes along, and it's encouraging to see in a very practical way how the audit process has supported and assisted in that process. So I think that's very encouraging. So questions, well, indeed for Matt or Scott on this report. Tim and Tim and Murray.
I thank you, Chair. I think Murray was first, but if you'll forgive me, and since you've invited me, Chair, I'll go first. It's really Tim Wright, a member of the board and member of the Audit and Risk Committee. It's a clarification question, really. Please, I mean, it's a really interesting and welcome report. Lots of good stuff in there. Very pleased to see the stuff around Microsoft Direct Access being used, but there's a comment about multi-factor authentication. And it's just really a clarification. I understood this was still an ongoing project. Is it now completed, or so can we accept that multi-factor authentication is used across the entire organization, or is it still a work in process? So it's really a clarification issue. That's as much as anything else. Thank you.
Matt, are you able to respond, or is it one for John?
I think that might be one for John on that one.
Yeah, I think it's that would be something that we'd probably just have to pick up with ICT, Tim, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's fine, Don. It's not a huge point. I just wanted to clarify. I thought it was still an ongoing process. So, the report suggests that it's and may be correct that it is across the entire organisation. I'm not sure that it is. So it's really just a point of clarification for me.
Okay, I wouldn't want to say
if you don't know.
I wouldn't want to say it's 100% and then find out it's potentially not. So rather than do that, can we take it away as an action?
Absolutely, no problem at all.
Back to the committee, if that's okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Heather, would you be able to make sure we collect that as an action, please?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mary.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the report's great actually, and I really appreciate some of the details that are coming out in there, and I also appreciate the fact that we're on a journey in the learning, and hopefully this will inform some of the agile working development. I guess there was a bit just in terms of two things, and they're really just to invite some further observations from yourselves, probably a little bit from Scott, maybe a little bit from Matthew, but generally it's around in the areas for improvement, the third point down, around the thinking about organisational risks associated with agile working. And in this instance, I'm mainly concerned, and concerned isn't the right word, and focused would be a better word, on the working that takes place outside the individual's home, but not to the exclusion of that, if that makes any sense. And it is about it points in the report, it talks about health and safety, it talks about safety in the context that there are other things beyond the actual individual's health and safety needs and workplace assessments, etc. And for me, I think it's really edging towards actually talking about security in the broader sense than the multi-authenticator stuff that Tim was talking about. I'm talking about just simple elements of actual just common sense safety, managing personal data, etc. And it doesn't reflect as much on that as maybe I'm looking for a wee bit of over and above what's in the report itself, and maybe an update in terms of how we're thinking about some of that, if that's possible to do, or if not, then direct me to where I can get that. And then the other thing was just towards the end when we've got the actual staff reflections included, is that point around, as much as I welcome the agile working, I think it's appropriate for a 21st century organisation to be looking at it. There is the issue around actually staff connectivity to each other and the relationships that are there, and it is picked up in the comments. And I guess to some extent it's maybe more a question for Scott, but I mean, how much is that being taken account of within the concept and development around the agile working as well?
Okay, who wants to pick this up?
I can come in there, Chair, if that's
yeah.
okay to
Thanks,
kick things
Scott.
off. So I think, Mary, thanks for that. In terms of the point you make about security, just in general, it's not even just the cyber security, it's even physical security and safety. And we were exploring that as part of the debrief with my colleague Julie in health and safety, and that was where the concept of the checklist came around. And that actually it's when people are working out with, if we call them controlled environments, if you like, i.e. your house and an SFRS site, we've got a wee bit more control about making sure we look after those safety aspects. But that's very much at the forefront of our thinking around the advice and guidance we give to staff in terms of where they're working and things that they should be looking out for and considering. We touched on a wee bit with Julie. It's not truly solely aligned, but similar to that kind of lone working thinking in terms of making sure you're doing the right things and considering the environments that you're maybe going into and making sure that your own personal safety is as well of that, whether it's kit, equipment, data, whatever the case may be, is covered. So it's definitely in the forefront of our thinking there in terms of how we share that and guide and educate our staff with what they should be thinking about and doing in respect of that, working in a Costa Cafe or a, wherever it might be, somewhere else other than home or an office. So that's very much in the forefront of our thinking. I think the point that you make about the connectivity, it's absolutely a key point and was very much a big feature of the drop-in sessions we had with staff, and the importance of us remaining networked and connected to colleagues or teams or colleagues and also the organisation, because it's very easy to feel isolated, and that's came through quite a bit in some of our dialogue and conversations, not just as part of the Agile Working Launch, but actually over the last 18 months or so. And it's something organisationally we're working really hard at promoting that message and the importance of staying connected with colleagues and teams. One of the messages we promoted to the Agile Working Session is that it's not a case of I'm all right, Jack, I'll see you in a couple of years' time, I'll go away and work away my own in terms of and go on with whatever it is I'm doing, and there is an expectation there for you still to engage and still to remain connected, and that's the key part in this. It doesn't mean that we will never be face to face again, and I think that's an important part, and the expectation of us as employees that there will be times and occasions where we will be back in a face to face setting. So that connection part is really important from a perspective of productivity, team building and the likes, but also making sure that we don't lose sight of the emerging kind of evidence, if you like, of the feeling of isolation some people have got as a result of now working remotely. And we have also had feedback from some staff who can't wait to get back into the office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, because that's where they do their best stuff and they thrive more in that environment. So what was said by way of that connection is really important. That we're not saying it's now agile working here, so that's the only way to work. It is another way for us to work, but with the proviso that it's in the interest of the employee. Absolutely, we don't lose anything by way of performance and productivity and connection with team, and it also has to work for the wider organisation too. So there's a number of things that we're encouraging as staff explore the opportunities to work in a different way. Let's not lose sight of some of the things that absolutely matter, and making sure that we're connected and not feeling isolated is one of them.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Has that addressed everything, Manny? Yeah. Okay. Leslie.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Scott. I think what the organisation did in a very short period of time to support people working remotely was remarkable and excellent. And the initial kind of conclusion of this report is saying it's good practice and it's all going well. Again, it's testament to the good work of staff. Couple of questions. First one for Matt, and it's about the sample size. Now, from what Scott says, the response of staff, it's a small sample size, but it does appear to be representative of the bigger organisation. But I just welcome your comments on the fact it's really a very small sample. The question for Scott is about the training, and I know it's always very difficult to decide which elements of training are mandatory. And I'm just curious to know what your rationale was for not making elements mandatory. And I'm also interested to know what level of take-up there have been in the modules that you've got to support managers in this work. Thank you.
Okay, so Matt on the first one, and I think Scott on the second one.
Leslie, can I just confirm you're talking about the staff survey results that we're talking about in Appendix B in relation to the sample size question, just so I'm making sure that I'm responding to the right point?
Yes, it was you contacted 55 and you ended up with 7 or 9. Is that right?
Yes, that's fine. I thought that was the point that you were making, and probably a fair and reasonable question to ask. That was a little bit of a challenge in terms of the way that we undertook that was direct, phone calls, email exchange with staff, and for that we effectively needed agreement from the staff to be able to engage with us from a data protection aspect, and that took a reasonable amount of back and forth with the support of management to make sure that we got access to that. Ideally, we would have liked to have had a larger sample and undertaken more of those, but that was the totality of people that we were able to engage with. That's why we have, to some extent, put that as a separate appendices rather than being directly linked to our findings, recognising that this is an indication of some things which have happened rather than something I want to say that it is a statistically significant sample to be able to put the hat on. Hopefully, Leslie, that addresses your question, but for me, as Scott's already alluded to, I think a lot of the things that we were picking up on have also translated from some of the work that management have noted themselves, and that's why we felt it was useful to include the information in the report as well.
Okay, and Scott, can you address Leslie's second point, please?
Thanks, Chair. Yes, and thanks again, Leslie. I'll be honest, this is one of the recommendations that has had us thinking in relation to what mandatory would look like and what would be involved in it. It's a part for us where so far we haven't put it down there as being mandatory. It's been engagement through dialogues and drop-in sessions, and it's something, as I say, the group that we're going to be progressing the audit with, it's something that we're currently considering. How would we do that and how would we deliver it? Would it be through, let's say, an LCMS module, for example, and actually what would the content of that be? So it's certainly one of the recommendations we're still giving some thought to, Leslie, in terms of not just the fact that it's mandatory, but what would the content be and what would help. So by way of exploring that, one of the areas the group are looking at is setting up I'll call it a management kind of peer group, if you like, because that helps with the lessons learned piece as well, and just getting a sense from managers about what helps and what some of that content would be, so that we can build the content and then look at where that fits by way of optional development, where we've got a lot of information and resources available on our iHub site, but when it comes to the mandatory piece, what would we include in that, and then obviously how we would roll it out. But as I sit here today openly, that's the one that we're giving most thought to. So it's a really relevant question in terms of what will that look like going forward. But it's something the group will certainly be progressing in the weeks ahead.
Thanks, Scott. Brian, could I just pick up on that, please?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Scott. I guess the question in my mind is whether we have a range of different attitudes regarding home working. I know pre-pandemic, when I was working normally, I've worked with colleagues and with bosses who were very pro home working and very trusting, and others who were, if you're working at home, then you're skiving, which is just, I find frankly shocking. But I know that there is a real continuum of opinions on agile working, and I just wonder if you have a sense that, and what was behind my mandatory training point was just, the organisation is saying this is the way forward, and if your views are not aligned with that, then those views need to be challenged a bit, potentially through mandatory training. So have you got a sense that there is that kind of range of views in the organisation, and how are you dealing with it?
Yeah, I think there is, and that certainly came through the drop-in sessions that we had. What we're asking as part of launching the framework is for people to have an open mind to the art of the possible and what we can do. Recognise and embrace that what works for myself maybe wouldn't work for yourself, Leslie, and there is difference across teams, and to keep an open mind. I think importantly, we've been working in this way for 18 months now, not 18 days. Therefore, we actually have formed new routines and practices that have been tested. I think there's some areas where we can improve again, or continue to improve, as I said at the start of the when I was speaking. I think we have a mix of managers who are used to having their team in the office and around them and with an eyesight. I think the issue that the point he touched on there around trust was also something we covered in the workshops and was raised with managers about how we know and how will we know around productivity and output and whatnot. So I think it's fair to say I think the majority of the managers I've been speaking to are open-minded and keen to explore the opportunities are there because they themselves are benefiting from it too. It's not it's for everyone in that sense. And where we've actually went to is making sure that we include our operational staff in that who, whilst working on the 5-watch duty system, that doesn't agile working isn't just about the work pattern you got. There's a whole host of other elements in there that we can look and explore to work and do things differently. But you're right, we went very quickly, almost overnight, from a face-to-face in the office presentee being seen culture to one where we're in all the different corners of the country, and feedback from managers very much has been, this is different. This can be challenging, and this isn't easy. So I think in that respect, the ask of managers and staff is be open-minded, to go try, test it, trial it. It might work, it might not, tweak and try it again. But I think the fact that we've been in this now for 18 months, the route back to all back to the office face to face, I think when you look out with even SFRS, all reports and research right now is saying that the future of work's more than likely going to be a blend of approach. So from our perspective, trying to support managers who maybe, if I could say, traditional in their thinking, are able to kind of move towards this new world of work, because without doubt it's changed and I think probably changed forever.
Thanks, Scott. And were you able to tell us a little bit about what take up of the modules, of the training modules that there has been?
So we don't have those. It's online in terms. It's just resources and information. We don't have a training module as such that people would be able to go in and access and complete. That's what we'll look to develop in time.
Okay, thanks. Ross, you have your hand up.
Thanks very much, Brian, and good afternoon, colleagues. Ross Haggart, Deputy Chief Officer. I just really want to pick up on a couple of points, if I may, Brian, just that Scott in particular emphasised there. And I say this all within the context of really welcoming the early audit on this. But I think and Scott spoke about that blended approach to work. And I hope that a lot of managers' previous perceptions of home working might have changed over the experiences that we've had of the past 18 months. But I think the proof of the pudding will be very much in how this pans out over the next few months. We're still actually very restricted in terms of that true blended working. And ironically, we've got the agile working framework in place, and I think it's right to have it in place now. But we've still got the organisational posture whereby, unless people's role or part of their role requires them to come into the workplace or for health and well-being reasons, we're still asking them to work from home. So although the early audit's really welcome, I think understanding how this framework and this policy is going to be implemented, it will take a few months and will actually need us to be in a position where we're being much less restrictive in terms of people coming into the workplace, which is absolutely being done for health and safety reasons at the moment. But I think it will take a few months so we properly understand what that blend's going to look like and people's approach to it going forward. So I just wanted to add that into the discussion. Thanks.
That's a very good point, Ross, that we're not at that normal stage yet where you can really assess how people will genuinely, when they have all these options, respond. But I guess what's encouraging is that the organisation has invested a significant amount of time and effort in positioning itself to deal with the last 18 months and positioning and learning from that process, which undoubtedly will help when things begin to open up and people do have these options. But I guess until we get to that point, no one will know how people will respond to it. But I think you can take from that, Matt and Scott, that this has been a helpful piece of audit work, well received by the organisation. So thank you to everyone involved in that. So moving on, the last item under internal audit, we have the report on the follow-up to recommendations. And Matt, are you going to talk to this one again?
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'll take the report as read, and any kind of particular more direct questions on specific points, happy to address those. There's probably a couple of key things that I just want to draw to the committee's attention. The first is one where we do have a relatively large number of slightly older actions, particularly with some extended dates around completion. And my second point actually goes slightly interlinks with that. And recently, John and myself met to discuss a way that we can try to be a little bit more active in taking those forward, partly linked to actually the discussion we're having on the action point on gifts and hospitality, where there's a bit of a risk because there's been a bit of time passed on these that actually what's being tried to achieve might have drifted a little bit and either expanded or contracted from the original point. So John and I have agreed that approximately once every 6 months, we'll do almost kind of a detailed stock take of the ongoing relevance of those actions to be able to kind of really scrutinise those in a slightly different way rather than almost the kind of iterative, has it been implemented or not? Let's see the progress with the evidence against that. We think that's an important step that will hopefully help to thin out some of the actions which are there at the moment. The other point that I'd just want to draw attention to is that a significant number of these actions link to both fraud policy and indeed the risk policies as well, both of which are on the agenda for this meeting with some further actions linked to those. So I'd anticipate that over the coming months and certainly by January, there will be a significant dent made in the progress with those actions. Other than that, there isn't anything else that I particularly want to draw to the committee's attention, but very much happy to take any comments either from management or indeed questions from the committee.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Leslie.
Thanks, Brian. Leslie Bloomer, board member. I don't think I said that last time, so let me correct that. Thanks for that, Matt, and I welcome the approach that you've outlined in terms of a deeper examination with John periodically. I think that will be helpful. I also welcome that I think 9 recommendations have been closed out since the last meeting, including the outstanding recommendation on ICT and data security, and also note and welcome continuing progress on fraud risk management. And as you say, happy to see that we're progressing in those fraud and on risk later on the agenda. I have one question, and it's in relation to the water planning arrangements, recommendation 4. That has a red status, and I would just welcome some explanation or thoughts really around what the matter is, why it's important, and where we're at with it at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. John, are you going to?
Chair, could I? It's
David. Yeah,
David
please
Johnson.
do.
I think one of the purposes of the follow-up group is to get that evidence that things are being progressed. And I think from the one that's turned red, I think through discussion with the directorate, it's really that at this present moment in time, we weren't given confidence, or we weren't being able to see what progress had been made behind the scenes. And I think that's the purpose of turning this red. At the same time as turning it red, it's also through the Good Governance Board that Mark chairs, is almost using a spotlight system to ask the responsible directorate or persons to come to the Good Governance Board to have that discussion about, okay, is nothing happening, or actually is there more going on behind the scenes, and it's just how we articulate some of that activity. And just now, Chair, I think I would be wrong to say nothing's happened, because I know there have been discussions out with the follow-up group. I think just at present, we just need a bit more information and a bit more assurance about where things are and how quickly this can now be kind of moved into some positive action that will show progress.
Thanks for that, David. It's helpful. But is Ross maybe able to tell us what it's about and why it matters? I mean, what difference does it make that this has slipped a bit?
Thanks for that, Leslie. Unfortunately, I'm not able to talk to the detail of that specific point, but I'm happy to take an action and we can get back to you off table rather than waiting for the next meeting on that specific action within there. What I can tell you and provide some reassurance is the overarching risk within the risk register associated with water planning has been de-escalated. Really good positive working relationships with Scottish Water now in place. ACO Stuart Stevens gave a risk spotlight update at the last Service Delivery Committee meeting, which was on the 1st of September, which articulated a very positive picture holistically in terms of water planning. So hopefully that provides some reassurance, Leslie, and to the wider ARAC, but more than happy to look at that detail and get back to you off table regarding that particular part of the action, Leslie.
Thanks, Ross. Brian, if you're comfortable and in light of the fact that the risk relating to water planning has been de-escalated, I'm happy just for an update to our January meeting. And obviously, I'm sorry I missed the update at the last Service Delivery Committee. I was on holiday, so I'm sorry I missed that. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It will presumably appear in some form in the January report, so happy to leave it to that. Any other comments, questions on the report? Just a couple of things from me, Matt. I was struck, and perhaps it's the use of red ink, the number of revisions to the implementation dates on quite a number of recommendations. I think in one case up to 7 times the date has been amended. And I know from previous discussions about optimism bias that the organisation, understandably wishing to do things and do them yesterday, might find itself in that slightly overly optimistic position, but to do that in some cases 7 times sounds like we're not kind of learning the lesson. So I'm just interested in what your observation is round about those. And the second point is that under the box AZ comments, there's a lot of what's written in that box that it's noted, that AZ says noted. It was my understanding that the completion of that box would reflect more a qualitative judgment by AZs about whether what you were being told about follow-up was evidence-based, whether it was reasonable, etc. So I wonder if you could comment on those 2 points, please.
Yeah, I'll take those in reverse order, Brian. The way that we would normally do is, if we are content with management's response, seen suitable evidence of progress that is supported by the comments noted, that we would usually use the simple management comment noted effectively as our way of saying we are in agreement with that. And by exception, we would highlight if there was something where we felt that either there was insignificant information to support that's the statements that are made, or any other issues that we would wish to raise. But a very fair question, and hopefully that addresses that query on that. On the red writing, and I think this is the first time, if I remember right, we have put the red text in to effectively draw the eye in the way that we have on this report. And I think, as we have discussed extensively at previous meetings, you're right, there has been probably a bit of an optimism bias on those things. And this was part of the discussion which has triggered the more recent conversations with John about the focus and going back to looking at how realistic and how continuingly relevant are some of these points. And that's why we are effectively escalating our approach into that. It's one where the passage of time allows us to reflect on these a little bit more clearly and begin to have some of these bubble up to the surface. And whilst I wouldn't want to throw the COVID situation out as a ready-made excuse in some of these, I certainly have seen across our client base that has impacted how quickly certain organisations have been able to address things, and that has nudged a number of recommendations out further than they were originally set for. I think we're probably in a little bit of a mixed position where that is one factor, and if they were just the more recent recommendations, I think I would be reasonably accepting as that as the primary factor, but some of these do predate COVID, and I think it's one where that's now a reasonable position for the more recent extensions, but there was issues that lay with some of those previously, and indeed there are some which are instances which are out with the direct control of the fire service, and those things perhaps have been significantly overly optimistic in the engagement that's required from other organisations and other stakeholders. I can see Gary, though, perhaps wants to add some further comment on that as well, though.
Yeah, Gary.
Just to say, Chair, that lots of those actions which are outstanding relate to older internal audit reports. One of the things we've been keen to do when we issue our draft audit reports to management and get management responses to the action plans in those reports is to challenge through the internal audit process about whether management are being realistic or not. I mean, at the time, at a point in time, you know, what you think might happen doesn't always happen, but I think we are doing more to say, do you really want to say to the audit committee that you will deliver this in July when it looks to us like it's going to take you till December to do that? And we've also, in meetings with management, when they're giving the management response, been clear to them that when they're signing up for the management actions, that they need to be clear that they can deliver them, because we will come back and report back whether or not that's happened. So I think that's raised the profile a little bit in management's mind about how they think about responding to action plans from internal audit. I just wanted to say that, so I would hope that going forward there will always be elements of things that happen that prevent management from meeting what they hoped would happen, but I'm hoping those should be fewer. Yeah,
no, that's helpful observation, Gary, and I think this is an iterative process. I mean, the fact that we talk about it a lot doesn't mean that not a lot is being done. It's just one of these things that's painfully difficult to deal with sometimes, and we all know why that is the case. But I wonder, when we get this report back to our January meeting, whether we could have a little bit of a focus, perhaps in just some sort of summary form, where there have been multiple implementation date changes, just to try and understand, you know, what's the cause of that, because on the face of it, it's hard to understand, you know, if you take Gary's point about being overly optimistic, well, you might do that once or you might do that twice, but repeatedly doing it, it requires a little bit of an explanation. And perhaps in that discussion between Matt and John, you're able to cull some of these older recommendations or modify them in a way that now makes more sense, because it just clogs up the reporting and clouds the clarity of the position if that's the case. So perhaps a little bit of focus on that in January would be helpful. Okay, Heather, could you just capture that as an action, please?
Noted, Chair, will do.
Okay, thanks. But I again, really welcome this report. I think the format of the report is really helpful, readable. I think everyone would like to see it a little bit shorter. Okay, so thanks very much for that. So that concludes our session on internal audit, and we now move to agenda item 8, which is the independent audit inspection action plan update. And Richard, you're going to talk briefly to this, yeah?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Richard Wetton, Head of Governance, Strategy and Performance. So, Chair, this is dealing with a couple of those stubborn pieces that we've had from a previous audit. Colleagues will see that this comes from a report published in 2018. Prior to May 2020, progress of this plan was monitored through our Performance Improvement Forum on a 6-monthly basis, but members will be aware that we've changed that in the last year or so, partly to address some of the comments that you were just making about making more progress against a range of audit recommendations. This one, the majority is complete, but we've had 3 outstanding audit recommendations, and that's contained within the annex material. of the three that that we have outstanding, that members will see there, 2 are proposed to have been completed within the reporting period. These were reported to us at the Senior Management Board, and we've accepted those to be closed, and 1 is outstanding. And again, there's a proposal to revise the date on that, and that's in relation to the standardisation of retained duty system specific terms and conditions, which again, members will be aware of that and how long it's taking. Overall, the action plan is noted as almost complete, 98% complete, and I'll leave that there and open it up for any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so just to clarify, Richard, are the 2 of the 3 that are currently shown as white now considered to be greyed out?
Yeah, they were the last 2 are closed within the last period, which is why we're just bringing them forward for you to see. And there's updates contained within there that are the most recent updates that we have from colleagues, and obviously Scott's here as well to help if there's any further questions.
Okay, that's fine. So just open that up to questions. No. So do you think that the next meeting will be the last time we see this particular report?
I would not like to hang my hat on that, Chair, given obviously the complexity around the particular issue that's remaining. But as you yourself said, there's an awful lot of work going on to try and push that forward.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Richard, and we duly note this report. So thank you.
Thank you.
That takes us on to item number. Oh, Robert, sorry.
Sorry, Chair, just a bit late with my hand there. Robert Scott, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Richard, it was just on the Appendix B within the paper. Just the title of it, I think, should be Audit Scotland Action Plan Progress as opposed to HMFSI Audit Scotland. When I read it at first, I wondered what those outstanding actions related to, but it's clearly not one of my reports. So just for the accuracy of the paper, I think it would be useful if that was removed.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Well spotted. We'll do that.
Thank you.
That's helpful, Robert. I believe I've made the same point previously, but clearly no one listens to me. So we'll see whether you have greater impact, and I'm sure you will. So thank you.
Unlikely, Chair. Unlikely.
Thanks very much for that. And then that takes us on to the Audit Dimensions report, which is otherwise known as the wider scope report for the year ending 31st March. Now, this was undertaken by Deloitte and was the subject to a single item agenda meeting on the 26th of August. So we have been through this in some detail. The report is here today just because there have been some adjustments to that report. So it's just to make sure that the committee actually sees a final version of this report. So we're not going to go back through this report, but what I would like to do is simply to invite Deloitte, perhaps Pat, Kenny, just to highlight any significant material changes from the earlier draft that we considered on the 26th of August, and then just to look to John to offer any comment on the action plan, and in particular any areas of management response that have been adjusted since that meeting on the 26th of August, and emphasising this is not to go into the detail of it, but just to highlight any changes so that the committee is aware of what has been adjusted in the interim. So Pat, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Pat Kenny from Deloitte External Audit. Yes, the changes that have been processed since the last meeting comprise really a response that to Brian's email. Brian sent me an email, and in the back of that, I made a few changes to the report. The main change in the summary of the report in the introduction was that we made it clear that that the audit was risk-based and proportionate per the wider scope guideline set by Audit Scotland. This was just to make it quite clear that the context for the report, that it was risk-based and was more likely, therefore, to identify areas for improvement, or the risk assessment process wouldn't have been working particularly well. So that it wasn't, in other words, it wasn't an absolute comment on the overall performance of the service. So I think the context of the report, that's been highlighted clearly, I hope, in the introduction to the report. There was also a couple of specific changes, again, following the chair's email. We made it clear on the training strategy recommendation that the key issue there was that there had to be regular reporting targets set in terms of which would allow the effectiveness and the implementation of the training strategy to be regularly assessed. So we made that crystal clear in the report. And we also tweaked slightly the wording in terms of outstanding internal audit recommendations, just to make that clear. I'll let John comment on the changes that in terms of the management response for the action plan. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Pat. That's very helpful. And just so that people are aware, I mean, that first change that Pat refers to is at the end of the third paragraph on page 3. Should you want to have a look at it in due course. But I think that's a really helpful adjustment to that report, so thanks for that. And John, just on the management responses, and anything in particular you'd like to draw out in terms of what's changed from the August session?
Yeah, Chair, thank you. I never said the first time, John Thompson, Acting Director of Finance and Procurement, so apologies for that, Chair. So yeah, in terms of where we are with the wider scope audit, we took on board the comments in particular from the audit committee around the management responses, and they were seeking some clarity in a number of areas. So those responses were updated, and that was now a part of the revised report that you're seeing today. I have to say there was also 2 additional responses where, as part of the kind of pre-agenda meeting, there was again a request for further clarity, and that was at 2.1 and 3.1, and there has been a revised response provided by management with regard to that updated overall management response. I think that's been furnished to the ARAC committee, and I also have sent it on to Deloitte so that they can update. And it was really just to give greater clarity, particularly around when something was happening, and that was the kind of key points that was getting picked up by Leslie at the pre-agenda meeting. So I hope that's helpful. The only other thing that I would highlight is that we had been asked to make sure that we weren't too optimistic in the dates, and therefore we took the opportunity to revise those dates, and in particular that I think most people had revised the dates, but I noted when I was going through the pack for ARAC that there still had been some changes in dates that hadn't been updated. So again, I've highlighted those to Caroline. There was 4 dates, 1.3, 1.4, 2.3 and 2.4. And it was an extension of the timeline from 22 to 23, and that was based again on reflecting on what we need to do in terms of actions to deliver against those due dates. So hopefully that helps both to give the committee some clarity, but also that we have went through the management responses and updated accordingly, Chair. So I don't know if that's sufficient for your purpose, but happy to take any further question.
Yeah, very sufficient, John. I wonder for the record whether you could perhaps offline just give the detail of those changes to Heather so that we can record those in the minutes. That would be helpful, and so that we have that audit trail from the document that we have in front of us. Thanks very much for that. Interesting that your optimism bias is moving in the opposite direction now, but I think that's and as we come back to this action plan and look at progress, you know, we will have the opportunity again to look at the dates, etc. Leslie, you had in particular a number of comments previously on this action plan. Have you had the opportunity to look at it, and not in any detail, but in broad terms, content with what's been adjusted?
Yes, I think we had a robust discussion at the last meeting we had regarding this report, and I welcome the narrative alterations that Deloitte have made, and I welcome the different management responses being clarified. So happy with all of that. Thank you, Brian. Excellent,
thank you. Are there any other comments or questions on this report? Because we are being asked to scrutinise it, but on the basis that we're really just wanting to talk about the adjustments, that's the limitations of our scrutiny on this occasion. But I think the combination of the conversation today and the detailed conversation on 26th of August allows us to confirm that we have given this adequate scrutiny. Okay, thank you. And now the focus for this piece of work will be on the action plan. So thank you very much to everyone for. Okay, then that takes us on to a couple of policies that we have in draft. We have the anti-fraud and corruption policy and the risk management policy, and as Matt indicated earlier, the finalisation of these policies will help the organisation address some of the outstanding audit recommendations. So we're now into the David Johnson part of the agenda. David, you're going to take us through initially the fraud policy.
Thank you, Chair, and bear with me. I think I've got 4 reports that follow, so I'll do my best to get through them and give as much information as I can. The first one is the draft anti-fraud and corruption policy that's there for scrutiny. This pulls together the kind of previous anti-fraud policy and the fraud response plan into a single document. We've also produced, I think, a year and a half ago, a fraud risk assessment that formed another part of the fraud audit, and that's now incorporated within the annual assurance process, fed back through the heads of function. And again, the purpose of that is to identify those areas of risks, and more importantly, the things that we will now do about them to help manage it. So the policy itself pulls together that framework, allows people to understand the kind of potential areas of fraud, the methods by which we can report those, and the methods by which we will manage them. I think it's also important that it's not seen in isolation. I talked before about the gifts, hospitality and interest policy. There's also the whistleblowing policy that's out for consultation just now as well, that provides that framework and assurance that we are looking to manage, identify fraud. And what I hope is that the fraud policy provides that assurance. I think one of the important things, and again, I alluded to it at the very beginning, in terms of generating awareness and understanding within the organisation. We've already gone through some initial, or we've already provided some initial fraud training undertaken through CITFA, but we've also now developed an LCMS package that, whilst it's live on the LCMS system just now, it's the discussion now is about how we roll that out to the full organisation to enhance awareness, to enhance understanding. And a part of the role myself and the team will take is to actually go out and have that direct engagement with directorates. So the anticipation of the policy is to raise that awareness and to give us that framework within which to have information reported to us, and then something in which we can actually manage that information. And coming back through that is reports to the Good Governance Board, and also through John, through yourself, Chair, to ARAC, where we have any issues of fraud. And again, the policy is there, and I will do my best to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you, David. So any comments or questions for David on fraud policy? Tim and then Leslie.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I read this with a lot of interest, David. Thank you very much for putting it before us. I wanted just a little clarification for me. I always seem to be asking for clarification, don't I? But I wasn't as familiar with the Good Governance Board as I probably should be. So I wonder if you could maybe tell us how that's constituted and when it meets and who's on it, because I'm not as familiar with it as I perhaps ought to be. And I did have one specific question as well about actions when there's notification of an actual or suspected fraud. So I'm referring specifically to material on page 8 of your document. And there's a bullet point to consider in consultation with the line manager the sensitivity of the allegations in terms of public interest and whether the communications team, chief officer, or chair of the board should be briefed. And I just wonder if you could maybe set out the circumstances where you didn't think it would be appropriate to alert the chief to an instance of fraud, just as sort of indicative of as to how that might be applied.
Thank you. I think first off, the Good Governance Board and Richard will be able to kind of provide further information when I maybe get it wrong. I think before we had a Corporate Assurance Board, that kind of was taken forward into a Good Governance Board chaired by Mark, and I think John Thompson's is the kind of deputy chair of that, and it provides that focus for the kind of areas of governance and planning that we can bring before the organisation, providing assurance, and again, the kind of follow-up work for internal audit is provided through the Good Governance Board, risk management policy, and Richard will be able to provide other areas, because I'm desperately trying to remember the terms of reference.
Well,
that's
David,
fine, I understand. Yeah.
How about if you just address perhaps Tim's second point. And Richard, if you could come in on the Good Governance group, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of an example where not everything that may be reported initially is a fraud. Items may be lost or cannot be found, and where that information is provided to us, we'll investigate that. A member of my team will go out, investigate it, understand whether or not there is something that we need to actively engage with both John as Director of Finance and also with Liz as the Director of POD, about whether we believe there was an actual fraud in place or fraud undertaken and whether Police Scotland should become involved. So I think for myself that we will go out and investigate a potential allegation. That does not mean it's fraud at that time. So in my head, I suppose at that point in time, we wouldn't be forwarding reports more widely. Where we go out and understand that somebody may have misused a signature or falsely used a signatory, that's something that potentially has an issue more widely, that we should then be raising across the organisation. And in the first terms, we would be coming back to John to look at the information we found, and then to have the conversation about whether further information is required from Police Scotland. And I suppose at that point in time, the consideration would be given to then more widely indicating that at the time within the organisation, and then separately through ARAC, we would be coming back with a kind of formal report, as we have done in previous years when a formal fraud has been identified.
Thank you, Dave. That's helpful. So if I can just summarise that, it's more applies when at the point at which you're investigating suspected fraud. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay,
and Richard, can you pick up Tim's first question, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tim. So the Good Governance Board really is the place where we look at a number of a whole range of activity related to the good governance of the organisation, and we base that around SIP for international framework, etc. The kind of things that we have there that are in the terms of reference are around ensuring that we have a culture of compliance, that we review policies such as whistleblowing, anti-fraud and reporting processes, gifts and hospitality. We look at external engagement and consultation processes. We look at our partnership activity in terms of what we're doing externally. We look at a range of legislative and regulatory compliance issues, looking at procurement is covered in there, governance matters. Actually, I'm not just going to read out the whole terms of reference for you, but that's generally what we do there. What I suggest, Chair, if it's acceptable to you, I'm quite happy to forward the terms of reference to members of the committee so that they can familiarise themselves with it in more detail.
Yeah, sorry, you on my screen there, Richard, you just froze, but were you suggesting that you circulate the terms of reference for that Good Governance Board?
I was, Chair, yes.
Oh, yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you. Heather, can you pick that one up as well, please?
Yep, no, Brian, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Is that okay, Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, maybe it's just my failing, but I hadn't noticed that group before, so it was really just a clarification point for me.
Tim, it's where we do a lot of our performance management and business intelligence stuff goes there as well, which I know is of interest to you.
It is, so that's why I'm surprised. I don't read closely enough, Richard. That's my fault, not yours.
I'll send that out, Chair.
Leslie.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, David. Good to see this coming forward. A couple of points, a couple of general points, and then a specific. I'm presuming this policy covers expenses fraud and overtime fraud. Yeah, okay. I'm just wondering, would there be merit in having a list of common examples? Because I think sometimes people think of fraud as, big and, is very unusual and they'll never come across it, whereas actually expenses fraud and overtime fraud may well be attempted and they may well come across. So just, question, would there be merit in having a list of kind of common examples? Second general point is you will have referred to good practice examples and good practice guidance. Is there any element of what is generally considered good practice that you haven't felt applicable in this policy, and if so, why? And the last specific point is the same page as Tim was on, so it's page 8 and the top of page 9. This is about really the decision as to whether you're going to embark in disciplinary processes. And my question is, are we boxing ourselves, is management boxing themselves in too much by putting in this hurdle of gross negligence? So as I read the bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9, if the supervisor has been negligent but not grossly negligent, then the implication is that's not a disciplinary matter. So I'm just thinking through, whether, as I say, the inclusion of through gross negligence limits the approaches that management could consider in dealing with the negligence contributing to fraud. I hope that's clear. Hope that makes sense. If not, I'll try and explain it a different way. I've dealt with situations like this in the past, and you end up poring over every single word as you are trying to go through a procedure or indeed an employment tribunal, and that's why I'm particularly focused in on that point.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. David, are you able to pick that up?
In terms of the gross negligence point, Leslie, I'm desperately trying to think back. I did receive feedback from legal on some of the wording that had initially been incorporated, and I would have to look back and come back to you, if I may, about why the kind of gross negligence side was put in. I think a lot of it tries to understand the kind of the code of conduct, and trying to kind of not mirror some of that wording, but to try and feed into the other processes that we have available, because I think the fraud policy in itself will establish facts and look to take a initial appropriate action, and then it would be transferred over to an appropriate policy as and when that we're able to provide it's not even an outcome, to provide evidence about what we think has happened. So in terms of the use of the word gross negligence, I would have to look at why I changed that, and if that was on guidance from legal or if it went in line with another policy. So if I can do that, Leslie, and come back to you.
Yeah, okay. Obviously, the issue here is you don't then want the two policies conflicting, because you'll get people obviously just picking through them, and you don't want to lose a case, if you like, on technicality.
Yeah, and I think at the beginning we've made particular reference to the whistleblowing policy for a similar reason, that I think there are other. It's not a standalone policy. I think it links to a number of other areas of governance, and I think that the purpose of this policy is to raise awareness. It's to ensure people are aware of the processes. I think in part one of your initial question was about some common examples of fraud, and I think what we tried to do maybe in section 6.1, which is on page 15 of the actual policy, is give some of the danger signs, which would be perhaps some of those examples that you talked about: abnormal travel, pressure from colleagues, being unresponsive, reluctance to take leave, and then from an external point of view. So I think we've tried to incorporate some of the examples without making it too excessive. And we've also looked at other kind of policies to, I suppose for myself, we need a policy that's fit for Scottish Fire, but we also need to ensure that best practice is achieved. And in looking at other policies, I believe we're aligned to the other policies, and also aligned to some of that information in the SPFM. In terms of what Scottish Government is looking for as well, but we have taken that guidance from legal about some of the wording to make sure we're aligning with other policies. I don't know if that answers all of your questions, Leslie.
I think it does, David. I know John wants to come in, but no, I'm happy with the good practice point. I'm happy with the examples point. In terms of the wording, I'm happy for you to finalise it as you see fit, because that's not for us. That's a matter of detail, but it was just a question to raise. So I'm happy on all fronts, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And you put your hand down, John. Is that because David's answered the point?
Correct.
Okay, that's great. Well, I mean, so just on that gross misconduct point, I think it's an important point to clarify, but as Leslie suggests, we can leave it for you, David, to go away, do the necessary checking, adjust it if it needs to be adjusted. So that would be the action. It doesn't need to be reported back to the committee, just to take that action away. Just one point from me, and again, it's on page 8, which is getting a bit of a hammering, but and you and I have had the opportunity to have a bit of a conversation about the fraud policy previously, David. It's quite standard practice in the case of a suspected, and certainly in the case of an actual fraud, that the chair of ARAC is notified pretty promptly. I don't see that reference on page 8. Is it elsewhere, or has it just been omitted from the policy?
I would have to read through that, Chair. I think from my point, I think it's coming back to where we've had that initial discussion with John as the Acting Director of Finance, to understand what it is that's been reported, and at that point in time having that discussion about whether it's something that we believe, based upon the evidence, should be reported to yourself at that time immediately. I don't know if that answers the question, because I think any fraud would come back through yourself, Chair, and ARAC within your quarterly meetings. I think what I don't know if I picked you up right about, is it about the actual time of when we get something through as opposed to that formal reporting?
Well, two things, David. I mean, in my experience, it's considered to be good practice that in the event of even a suspected fraud, the chair of the audit committee would be alerted to that so that they were aware of it. And that being the case, in that penultimate bullet point on page 8, it talks about the chair of the board to be briefed. It doesn't make any reference to the chair of ARAC, and I just wonder whether that's an oversight.
That would be an oversight. That would have to come through to the chair of ARAC at that time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if that text could be adjusted to reflect that, then I'm comfortable with that.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. John.
No, just to give you comfort, Chair, certainly if there was a suspected fraud, I wouldn't wait necessarily to the quarterly meeting. I would certainly be contacting yourself and explaining the circumstances. So I want to give you that assurance, if nothing else. Assurance
received and understood. Thanks, John. Thank you. Any other comments on the fraud policy? No. Okay, David, thank you very much for that. We're being asked to scrutinise the policy. Can you remind me, is it the case now that this policy will go to the board to be signed off? So is it the case then that more appropriately we have scrutinised it and now, subject to those one or two minor points, recommend it for approval to the board? Okay, so there's nods there. So Heather, if we could make sure that the minute reflects that outcome. Okay, and then, okay, David, you're almost 50% through your task. Onto the risk management policy now.
Thank you, Chair. Again, the draft policy is provided for your information and for scrutiny. And again, similar just to your last point, Chair, it would also be going to, I believe, the board for that ratification afterwards. The policy is attached. The idea is promoting awareness of risk, seeking to provide assurance that we have those adequate systems of control in place and align it to our management of risk within our kind of processes. I think what's really important is that the framework has matured significantly over the last number of years. And the policy that was there was at a period of time. What we were actually doing in practice had changed, and the policy has now been updated to reflect those practices that we now have. And I think that's really important. The practices we now have, the anticipation is the provision of assurance, the ability for yourself, executive boards, and also department management teams to provide a scrutiny function of the risk information coming through has changed. I think awareness and engagement has changed. And what I'm hopefully have attempted to do within the policy is to simplify the written word, but at the same time increase the level of engagement, either within executive boards, committees, or within management teams, to really engage with them, to say this is important. I get very nervous in talking to people, and I usually start off by saying my role is to annoy people. And I think by that what I mean is I need to make sure fraud, verification, compliance, audit, insurance is at the top of their agenda as much as possible. And I think that's the purpose of the policy. The policy is there to provide that kind of framework, to let them know what's been asked of them. And then seconded to that is to go out and actually engage with them and make sure that what we're doing is suitable and sufficient. Section 3.4 says we need a period of stability. I think that's what the risk management audit has said. And I think that period of stability, in my eyes, is about the template. It's about the means of reporting. But at the same time, there's still more that we have to do to provide, to move towards a more risk mature level of activity. And again, we've talked about it before. I think the risk appetite, the work on risk appetite had started, and then it had unfortunately just been paused at that point in time. And I'll be coming back, I believe, to a workshop in January with the board, to have that discussion, to try and take forward some work and identify a risk appetite statement for the service. And the policy makes reference to that we will update the policy as that happens. It's not a single shot. I think the policy is trying to say this is going to be something that will take a period of time to see whether or not we gain the most from it. So it will be over a year or so to understand how risk appetite can be used. The portfolio office is is developing new documentation that we need to ensure reflects the risk management practice and the risk management framework and has a consistency. And again, the policy provides a consistent method of recording and reporting on risk. So again, once the portfolio office is updated their information, we'll, if required, we will reflect that within the policy, but equally they'll reflect the risk management framework within their documentation. What we've created is a monster in terms of the new reporting template. What we've found is that people are finding it really useful. I think people have taken to it rather than say we've changed it again for the purpose of changing it. They have now found it is more transparent. They're using it as a management tool within management team meetings. But the result of that is we're now being asked for more information. So part of the work through Richard's team is to look at whether or not that we can add an additional level to our reporting tool to look at functional and project risk that would allow for that escalation and movement of information between. And again, that relies on a piece of work being undertaken by data services, which everything is now aligned. We're looking to automate it. So again, we're trying to get more technical in an ability to be able to talk more about it rather than spend a long time preparing reports. We're hopefully going to kind of tailor this to the needs of the organisation. So again, on one hand, I'm saying we need a period of stability. On the other hand, I'm saying we've still got more work to do. And what I hope is that the policy outlines both sides of that story about the good work that's happened and the good work that still needs to be completed. And again, the policy's there, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, David, thanks very much. Open up for comments or questions for David on the risk policy. Mary.
This is more of a flag for when we have a discussion later in the year as part of our risk appetite discussion. And I guess at some point in time it would be helpful for me, and I suspect it's my ignorance again, David, so my apologies. But in terms of the risk descriptions and the risk scoring, etc., it's difficult for me to interpret how that becomes reflective of different appetites at different points, if that makes any sense, and how these things interact. So I don't necessarily think it's for a discussion for today, but I guess I'm flagging it up because I think when we get to have that discussion, it would be useful for me to understand how that then comes out in terms of those approaches, because these are very, very definitive descriptions about risk in terms of the risk descriptions against those scores, and yet we may have an acceptable tolerance of risk that is higher, if I'm making any sense. But again, I'm not necessarily looking to explore that today. I'm content with the policy as it is, but I would like to explore that when we get to our development session, just to help my understanding as much as anything else.
Yeah, no, it's a perfectly valid point, Mary, and highlights one of the challenges of applying risk appetite to something that is fairly clearly defined. And of course, risk appetite doesn't fall neatly into such definitions. But I'm sure when we get to January, we'll have ample opportunity to debate that, and David will show us the light. Paul. You're on mute, Paul.
Very taken with what you said under 3.4 about the portfolio office. I think that is absolutely critical. And I'd like that to be sort of marked as something which we should have a report back on to ensure that that has happened and that the two are fully aligned. We had a presentation to the board from the portfolio office, I think at our development day in September, and I really wouldn't like to see this becoming an issue that goes on for very long with the difference of approach. I think you're aware of that, David, and very conscious of it, but I really would like to have some assurance of that both parts of the organisation are fully in alignment there.
Through you, Chair, I think, kind of Paul, I think I've met in a number of times now with Andy Main, I think as head of the portfolio office. I think that's his correct title. And I think one of the things we can do in the short term is to ensure that the actual reporting of risk and how it looks is the same. I think it's the bit behind that I think is really important as well, in terms of how project managers perceive risk, and then to have that conversation with the committee about how they wish to manage risk at the different levels, because I think you have the project risk that could link to the directorate risk that can link, and I think it's just understanding how things are escalated. And for me, the biggest challenge is getting away from how things look in terms of the template to allowing the scrutiny bodies transparency of the information that's coming through, to make sure that the focus is upon that assurance and scrutiny process. And I think one of the things we'll do as quickly as we can is make sure the reporting of risk looks very similar. Paul, and if I could give you assurance, we've already had those initial discussions, and Andy's kind of leading that. I think he's pushing that. He's really keen to make sure that there's nothing that's out of alignment.
Thank you, David. If I can just come back, I think you're absolutely right. It's got to go down into the systems and not just at the top level reporting. But I would want to see them to be actually merging at some stage as they come up towards the scrutiny committees, so there's a common view by the time it comes up to ARAC.
Yeah, and I'm not sure on this point whether actually the service is doing itself a bit of a injustice, because the reporting of project risks does follow the fairly standard template. So to an extent, it's already happening. I think what 3.4 is referring to is a further review of that process and how it needs to be aligned. But I'd certainly welcome for the January meeting, David, whether we could have some specific update on the progress of that alignment process, so that we can understand what's been done, what needs to be done, and when it's to be done by. So if we could build that into the reporting on risk to the January meeting, please.
Will do, Chair.
And Heather, can you pick that one up as well, please? Yeah, and Robert.
Chair, I won't prolong it too much, but just probably an early heads up more than a question, that it's an item that I'll be particularly interested in, and as it plays out through items of change and continuous improvement and projects associated, certainly the Inspectorate will have a view on the board's decision-making process, but also the board's risk appetite in relation to making some of those changes. So just an early heads up, in the interest of being completely transparent, is something that I will be keeping a very close eye on.
No, and thank you for that, and I'm delighted to hear it too, Robert. I think that's a really valuable perspective to bring to the organisation around the issue of risk and change management. And I would certainly welcome an opportunity to have a chat with you offline at some point, just to maybe talk about that in a little bit more detail.
I think that would be very useful, Chair.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So, any further questions on the risk policy? So, no. Okay. Well, on that basis, David, you can take it that we have scrutinised it and will be recommending to the board its approval of the policy. And just to say in summation that I think both policies are very, very good. So well done on that. I just want to do this one last item 12, and then we'll have a short break. And that's the quarterly update on gifts, hospitality, and interests. And again, it's with you, David. I don't think there's much to be said on it.
No, Chair. Again, this falls to the end of Q2 in terms of the gifts, hospitality, and interest that have been noted to my team. Appendix A outlines the 3 interests that we have noted at present, and they are now published on the website. Where others are received below the kind of threshold that we've set, that information is not published. And again, just referring back to the initial action log, it's about how we engage, how we raise awareness within the organisation about the need to report. But again, I'll take any questions that you may have just now, Chair.
Okay, any questions? No. Leslie.
So just briefly, continue to be concerned about the number of cases who are not self-identified. But I know that that's what you're talking about, David, is promoting the new policy, and I'm just looking forward to feedback on how that's going, and just hoping to see a greater level of self-identification rather than relying on a National Fraud Initiative or other financial processes.
What I would say just now is, Chair, I think Karen, who's also on the call today or in the meeting today, is going through the current NFI process, and so there may be other areas identified. I'll get it wrong, but I'm sure come January, February time, I think when we're having to kind of provide that information in the first kind of end Q4, Q1, there may be other interests that people, and again, we have, from a fraud point of view, we don't believe people have done something on purpose. I think we believe they have not actually declared something because they were segregated from the action. And again, I think that's the important part, that we've not identified something that is having to be reported back through John and then onto ARAC. I think the first two of them, we've identified somebody came to us directly, another conversation arose because a supplier was being set up, and again there was a direct engagement. So I know there are some examples. There are not that many, and I think that's part of it is reflective of we're working from home and we're not actually engaging more widely as we used to. But I think for myself, it's about communication engagement to make people aware of their responsibilities to provide us with information.
Yeah, I think, David, I mean the crux of our concerns, as we've expressed them previously, is that the vast majority of interests that are being highlighted are being identified through the National Fraud Initiative. People are not coming forward and making you aware of the interest, and that's why we were particularly keen to understand whether the new gifts and hospitality and interest policy had the desired effect of making people aware that they had to report interest, because it is unusually low in numbers for an organisation of this scale, which has got, arms across the whole of Scotland. So I think we if we see from the National Fraud Initiative a much longer list, it provides us with further evidence and concern that the message hasn't yet got through to staff. So I really do need us to come back to this point in January, just to talk about, well, if it's still not happening, does that mean people aren't reading the new policy, they don't understand the policy, they're refusing to comply with the policy? So I'll leave those questions kind of sticking to the wall, but it would be helpful to get a further update in January. What I also wanted to talk about in relation to this report, and I stress, I don't want for you to talk about in a public meeting any personal information about any of the three people highlighted in this report. But what I'm keen to understand is that the new policy has a process which is, once an interest is identified, it will be investigated, and if judged to require the addition of extra controls to be put in place, these controls would be put in place. And it would be helpful to understand how that's working in practice, if you can give us assurance that that has happened in these three instances, and whether the actions taken, if deemed to be necessary, have been considered to be effective.
Chair, I'm happy to provide those forms to yourself, maybe out with the meeting. I know we've incorporated that additional aspect of control. I would be wrong in saying I've actually got the forms in front of me. Anecdotally, we have had conversations with those individuals that have come forward with information for the first two, and I understand a conversation has been held about what additional action is required, if any, and I know for one of them that there's not, but I would be wrong in saying there would be nothing required for the other one. So if allowed, I would be happy to come back to you separately, Chair, to provide that assurance.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think as an interim measure, David, I'm happy for us to have that offline conversation, and perhaps an outcome from that offline conversation, we can agree what might be reported to the January Audit Committee to provide that broader assurance that we're looking for. So if others are content, that's how I suggest we proceed there. Okay, Heather, could you pick up that offline conversation with David as an action, please?
I will do, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, well, according to my timetable, I'm running slightly late by about 15 minutes, but can we take a short break? Okay, so thanks very much for coming back so promptly. That takes us on to the internal controls update and the strategic risk register. And David, you're going to talk to this item again. I wonder, given the changes to the format of the reporting, David, whether in your introduction you could maybe just take us through the various reports. We have Appendix 1A through to 1G, not in any detail, but just in sort of highlight, just to explain what these are. If you could do that as part of your introduction, that would be helpful.
Will do, Chair. Thank you. The report provides the committee with the kind of current update as at the end of Q2, coming back through from the meetings with directorates. In the past, the Appendix would have the overarching strategic risks of the service together with the aligned directorate risks and corresponding controls. And again, the format of that had changed, so moving out with the Excel report, coming back into a kind of more focused report. But within the main body of the kind of overarching report would be any of those changes that have been made within the last quarter. And I think what we've reported to SLT, what I'm starting to report to other directorates and to boards and groups, is trying to encompass all of that within the main body of the Appendix. So the Appendix you have, as you say, 1A to G, the Appendix A, Appendix B and Appendix C would have been the information you previously received. So when we're coming to Appendix E, and Appendix D and E, we're starting to actually give a bit of audit trail. So rather than just saying, look, this is the stuff that we still got to do, we're now starting to provide that evidence of some of the work that has been completed, some of the risks that have been closed and the reasons for that. We're also starting to kind of provide some additional information in terms of what those new risks and new associated controls are. And again, some of that's been through feedback from your own committee, Chair, but it's also been back from management teams that are saying, look, it's really good to understand what we still got to do, but they need to provide assurance to their own director about this is the good activity that have allowed us to actually change that risk rating. And again, one of the other appendices that's not in yours would be where the risk rating has changed and then the reasons for that as well. So again, my hope is that the report starts to provide a bit more information for yourselves in a manner that's more transparent and in a manner that you can actually challenge. The purpose of that risk register from an operational point of view is to ensure effective discussion, decision making can take place. Coming through to yourself, the register allows that challenge, and hopefully the challenge or the provision of additional assurance is something that the report actually gives you a kind of clearer sight on. So in terms of the actual report, Chair, I think I've kind of summarised the first A, B and C are just what you would have seen before. I think the other appendices just start to provide that additional piece of information and slightly more more information rather than just a kind of sentence that I may have provided in the past. And I don't know if that covers it adequately enough, Chair. I'm happy to discuss any part of it, but I think what I'm trying to move away from is my interpretation of what I think some of that summary should be, and actually pulling out directly from the Director at Risk registers what the responsible owners and officers are saying. And again, it's a direct lift from their registers, and it's just trying to provide as much information as I can for yourselves. And what I'm hoping is that I'm getting closer to what you might need, or we're actually there just now. And again, it comes back to the risk management policy, that it's looking for that period of as much as possible stability, that this report is now what's coming out to all of the committees, to all of the executive boards, and also to management teams. So again, the stability is really important, to let people get used to it, to make sure that when they're putting information in, those actions are smart, because we're also saying, when are you going to complete them by, and how's the progress going against it? So again, we're trying to use it more as a management tool. Yeah. And again, I'm happy to answer anything that I can, Chair.
Okay, thanks, David. I mean, can I just clarify then? You're saying that Appendix 1A, B and C are what we've seen before. Appendix D and E are the risks that have been closed off, have been removed.
Yeah, what you would have seen in the past would have been anything that's open. You wouldn't have actually seen some of the controls that have been closed, or where confirmation has been received from the directorates that those risks are closed.
Can I just clarify, when you say closed, does that mean that the risk has been removed from the risk register?
In terms of the control, the risk may still be there, but some of the controls relative to manage that risk have been completed.
Right, so where there has been something which has been time bound and it has been actioned, would that qualify as
closed? As
closed, okay.
Yes, Chair. So, and again, what you can have is one of the conversations, and it'd be still to kind of manage a way to capture it, is where actions are being completed. The action may be to monitor as business as usual, but again, the directorate is still wishing to kind of keep that risk on, to maintain focus on it. So we do not always need to have a control, but if we don't have a control, what I'm looking to show is the controls that have been completed.
Okay, well, I think in a sense, this is a new format. We have to, from a committee perspective, test it, try it, you know. So I'll open this up to comments and questions for David, both on the kind of new format, but importantly, on any kind of key areas of risk that anyone has any questions on. Leslie?
Thanks for that. Thanks for explaining it, David. I found that helpful. My kind of, I don't have any specific questions on the risk paper this time on the content of it. I quite like knowing where the risk rating has changed and why, and what actions then fall out of that. But what was your thinking? You're giving us a lot here. What was you thinking about not giving us that bit? Because I'm kind of less concerned about the actions that have been completed. But I would, what was you thinking about not giving us where the risk rating has changed?
No ratings would have changed on this occasion in relation to those risks that report through to ARAC. So,
okay. So you would tell us normally then?
Yes, within other reports where our rating has up or down, there is an additional appendix that would actually provide whether it's gone up or down, and then the reasons why.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I'll kind of come back to that point, but before I do, are there any other questions or comments on the risk register? No. David, as you know, I've been very supportive of the developments around about risk, and I continue to be. one of the things that I did like was the overarching commentary on risk changes. You know, what's new, what's going up, what's going down, and I really feel I'm missing that here. But I think what you're saying is there's been no adjustment to the risk rating on any of the RAC aligned risk at the strategic and the directorate level in the last 3 months.
Yes.
Yeah, which feels a little bit unusual, but you know, let's accept that at face value. Because like Leslie, the thing that I felt that was missing above everything else here in this style of reporting was information on the movement on the risks. But if you're saying there's no movements, therefore there's no Appendix H, then that's fine. We'll have to wait and see an Appendix H to see what it looks like.
Yeah, I agree, Chair. I think looking back over previous reports, I think some of the commentary is about closed risks, new risks, risk changes, and it will change every time. So on this occasion, the discussion with directorates and the director is that they are comfortable with where things sit. I think what the report does do is actually provide some additional information to you in terms of those closed controls, which you didn't have before.
Yeah.
And again, some additional commentary on where there are new risks that relate to your terms of reference and new controls. Again, they're coming into the report as well. So what I hope is I would give you that assurance that as and when things change, the forthcoming reports would actually show where the risk rating has changed. And again, I can provide examples of that in terms of other committee information that's been sent out in this format, just if for you to look at, and just to show that information.
I think that would be helpful, because I thought we had previously agreed that this committee would have a role to play in looking at new format reporting to committees. And I'm not sure, I don't think we've had that opportunity. I think we're being presented with something that's already now been implemented across other committees. And I'm not precious about that. My concern is, you know, have you taken the views of committee members, not just on this committee, but other committees, or indeed the board itself, on what would work, what their needs are? You know, is it too much? Is it too little? So I'm just a little bit unclear, because I thought we were going to have that iteration before this stage, I think, and it appears that we haven't had it.
If I've overstepped the mark, that's something I apologise for. I think as part of it, it's how I develop that report that allows me to understand what all committees or executive boards actually want. So I had provided that report to SLT with the same ask about how is this information being presented. And I think today I'm asking that question of yourselves. I have presented it to other committees, so yes, I have. And if that's overstepped, as I say, my apologies. But my attempt is to try and get something that everybody is actually comfortable with, and to get to a point that even following today, if you are uncomfortable with the information that's been reported, everything emanates from the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee about how that would then look going forward. So I think my attempt was to try and develop my awareness of what people need, as opposed to try and do anything else.
Yeah, no, David, don't apologise. I don't consider you've overstepped the mark at all. I mean, so don't worry about that. I thought we were going to have a bit of a process before this point. That's the only point I'm making. I think what would be quite helpful is that certainly I have some specific comments on the format, but rather than taking up our time today, I think I'm quite happy to chat to you offline about that. But just at kind of initial glance, if you like, I think some of the benefits of the narrative reporting that we had to accompany the Excel spreadsheet as it was, I think we've kind of lost a little bit of the benefit of that in this. And I don't know what others feel, but that's certainly a sense that I have. And I'm not sure about that. I think that maybe we need to, from a committee's perspective, and what we don't want to get to is a position where, committees are saying, well, we need this, and it's something that the organisation is not using. We need ideally to get to a position that there is one size here, but it can be applied in different ways for different purposes. But just to kind of illustrate the point, from a governance oversight point of view, one of the key things that we are interested in is, are risks going up? Are they going down? How effective are the controls? And without that sort of overarching commentary, it makes it, I think, harder for us to exercise that scrutiny.
Hopefully going forward, Chair, where there is information in terms of that change of risk assessment, that would be contained. So I think what I'm trying to provide assurance of is I have not taken anything out of the information that you have previously seen. If anything, there's some additional information that's now come through in terms of that appendix, where there is a risk change of whether it's up or down, that will be provided to you. What I was trying to do is actually provide it in the appendix, by way of that tabular format, which follows a very similar process. So I think potentially that as this goes forward, or after we've had that conversation, Chair, it's to provide the assurance that there's nothing that will be missed from what you have previously had, and if anything, it will be enhanced.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that's the ambition, and I don't doubt that for one moment, David. John, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, just to give you, I suppose, a kind of perspective, the strategic risk register and the overall risks that are obviously presented to SLT, Brian, and again, when you talk about movements and risks, that there was very much movement in the risk register across the organisation, but also I think at an SLT level, we were actually very encouraged by the new format. It's something that we see as a really good tool, and one that actually gave us additional levels of granularity. So I think the organisation or the kind of wider SFRS is seeing the value in it, and I think it's a helpful way of progressing. I think your points are well made, however, around that kind of narrative, and if, as David has already alluded to, we've not lost anything, and we're trying to enhance the overall process. But I know there was a genuine desire to get something stable and settled, and something that the organisation felt we could really use as an appropriate risk management tool, and we certainly feel that we're getting to that stage. So I probably just wanted to kind of emphasise that point, Brian, if that's okay.
No, and I fully support the notion that we need to settle on something and use it. So I don't want to labour the point. What I would suggest is that David, if you and I can have a conversation offline at some point, just to talk through from a committee's perspective, that would be helpful. But yeah, I just want to remind you that I continue to be supportive of this development. I'm an accountant, I like tables, so but I also like some words round about tables as well. So do we have any other comments or questions on that, or shall we note it and move on? Right, okay, thanks very much, David, and I'll pick this up with you later. And then the last point under this item, anti-fraud and whistleblowing, verbal from you, John.
Yeah, so Chair, delighted to say that I have nothing to report to ARAC in terms of fraud or whistleblowing.
Good. Just as well you said that, given your earlier comments. Okay, thanks for that, John. And then that takes us on to the quarterly update from Robert, and we have your report, Robert, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to come along and give the update. You have got the paper in front of you, but things have moved on a little bit in terms of from when the paper was written and submitted to today's position. So I'll try and give you a more up-to-date position if that's okay. In regards to item 3, local area inspection work, I can confirm that all the field work for Argyll and Bute has now been complete. The report is in a very advanced stage, and probably the only thing holding up the publication is me being able to commit the time to read through the final draft and give my final changes before it is shared with the service. As you know, the first approach to that is to share the draft report with the local senior officer, and we hope to do that within the next week or so, again just depending on my ability to review the draft. It then goes to the DACO for that particular service delivery area, and then on through the formal process of being published on our website and shared with the organisation, which we hope to have done by November and have completed the entire thing by November, the beginning of November, hopefully. So we're not far away with Argyll and Bute. We've also just commenced over the past couple of weeks the inspection of Angus, which is our next planned local area inspection, and we have made contact with the service and have dates in the diary for discussions with the local senior officer and have presented our data request of items that we want to review. So we expect to conclude that report in February of 2022. And you may recall, Chair and committee members, that on taking up appointment, this was one of the areas of interest to me, local area inspections and the format of, and I've been given that quite a lot of thought over the past 6 months since I've been appointed. And I've taken a decision that we will review and change the way that we carry out our inspection of activity at a local area. I think the process that's in place at the moment has been in place since 2014, and the inspectorate currently focus on activity from the Fire and Rescue Service at a local authority level, of which there are 32 across Scotland, as you know. In the 8 years that we've been carrying out these inspections, and even if we are to include Argyll and Bute and Angus within our numbers, we will have carried out 16 inspections of those 32. So, you know, doing the simple maths would tell you that it would take us 16 years to get round the whole of Scotland, which in my opinion, you know, it's really not the best use of resources and doesn't provide the best picture of what's going on across the whole of the Brigades area. So I've taken a decision to review that, and I will formally be in touch with the service to discuss how that might be reformatted and reshaped moving forward. But my early thoughts on it for the committee's benefit are that we would move to a series of service delivery area inspections, of which there are only 3, as you know, and we would carry out an inspection of each of those service delivery areas on an annual basis. So within 3 years, we will have a full picture of activity across the service rather than a 16-year turnaround that I referred to earlier. Within those service delivery area inspections, we will still obviously be very interested in finding out how the service are delivering a fire and rescue service at a local level, and we will be engaging with local authority partners, other blue light partners, and the same individuals that we would be speaking to during our local authority process. The only difference being that instead of taking the blanket approach to visiting every fire station in the entire brigade that we currently do during local area inspections, we would take a sampled approach and we would visit an agreed number of stations during that year. I think it's a better use of resource, and I think it will provide us with a better picture of performance across the local areas and across the service delivery areas. So more to be considered: the shape, the feel, the format, what we're measuring, how we're presenting our findings, all to be determined, and we hope to include the board in that discussion. And I will be approaching the chair, Kirsty, in due course to ask for permission to attend one of your strategy days and to come along and speak to the whole of the board about our planned approach and hopefully seek your opinion on what would be useful to you. I see Leslie has her hand up on that particular point, Chair.
Okay, Leslie.
Tim was ahead of me.
Oh, such is the interest. Tim.
I wouldn't have complained, Leslie, if you wanted to go ahead, but it's an obvious comment, I suppose. But thank you for that. That's very interesting, Robert. The idea of switching to areas rather than to the more granular approach that we're using now. Clearly, that has some implications for us, and I don't propose that we debate those at length today. But at the moment, local area reports we simply see, and they are responded to at a local level. If it was done at a service area level, I imagine that that would have implications in terms of the way that we reviewed it and considered the actions that arose from that. So it's probably stating the obvious. I apologize if it is, but it might represent quite a considerable change to the way we dealt with the reports that you produced for us.
No, absolutely. I think you're wise to pick up on that, Tim, and it's a discussion point probably for the strategy day. But you know, how we report what we report on and how those recommendations are picked up by either this committee or the Service Delivery Committee is certainly going to feature in our formatting of any new inspection regime that we put forward. So hopefully pick that up in more detail when we meet with the entire board, Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks. Leslie?
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Brian. Again, I think this is one for discussion at the strategy day, but I'd just be interested to hear from you your thinking and benchmarking, because you can benchmark at local authority level, LSO level, SDA level, and country level, and so just be quite interested in discussing that further with you at the strategy day. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, another really key issue, and what we'd like to achieve is an opportunity in the first instance for us to benchmark performance across the LSO areas within the service delivery area to understand how the overall performance is made up from the individual LSO performances, and over the 3-year period obviously have the opportunity to benchmark across the entire brigade at service delivery and LSO levels, which I think would be really useful for us, but even more perhaps useful for the board to have that picture of performance across the whole of Scotland. And also, I think we have already spoken about this, but the detail has yet to be figured out, I guess, amongst my own team, but we would be mindful of what is happening across the rest of the country and in some occasions across the rest of the world, in an opportunity to seek best practice and present that within the reports. So yes, we are absolutely cited on that. It's a big issue for me, benchmarking, and I'm very keen to try and factor that in. Okay, can I move forward from the local area inspections, Chair?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so on to the thematic inspection work. Our climate change conference report, COP26 report, has now been published. You may have picked up on that from media releases. It was published on Tuesday, and in summary, we are content that Scottish Fire and Rescue Service are adequately planning and preparing for COP26 with a view to delivering a safe event. There are no recommendations within that report. It would have been almost it would have been crazy to publish a report with recommendations when the conference is due to occur at the beginning of November. By the time you had read the report and put an action plan in place, it would all be over. So there are some observations within there, longer term observations. I would encourage you to make yourself familiar with the content of the report, but it's not something that will feed through into your formal scrutiny arrangement.
Good.
The next report that we are working on is there are 2 others ongoing: firefighting in high-rise buildings, which we are now, I would say, well into the field work. So we've been up to Aberdeen, we've met with crews, officers and other interested parties. We've been to Edinburgh, we've been to East Renfrewshire, and Inverclyde, and we have plans to visit Glasgow and Dundee and to have further dialogue across those areas. We've also been fortunate enough to accompany crews on visits to high-rise inspections to watch them carrying out their daily duties, and we have also been able to attend training exercises and exercises in high-rise blocks within the area of Ayrshire, North Ayrshire, where we observed crews carrying out an evacuation of a disused property that had been loaned to the service from the local council. I'm very encouraged when I see that. I'm very encouraged when policy is practiced and exercises take place. I think it's very easy to sit in a room and write a policy and then pass it out to the organisation and expect it to be acted upon. But having the actual ground truth and playing it out through training and exercising is always very encouraging. And there's always lessons to be learned. And I think there, you know, I'm sure Ross would agree that there will be lessons that will be learned from those exercises that take place in Ayrshire, and there are another few planned for later in November that we will also attend. So we're very encouraged by that. It's good to see it happening, and we'll keep a very keen watch on that as this thematic progresses. We hope to conclude that particular piece of work by about February and be sharing draft reports with you March, April, with a view to having it laid before Parliament in May of next year. So again, it's one of those ones that is likely to gather some interest from the media because of the subject matter, because of the Grenfell Tower connections. But we have been very keen to stress right from the outset that what we are measuring here is Scotland's position against Scotland's risks and Scotland's built environment, and it is very much about your response to those risks and that built environment, and not about the risk environment other services may face. It's very different.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful.
Health and safety and operational focus is well underway. In fact, we're coming to the end of the field work. The very final visit we will have will be with the Chief Officer, Martin Blunden, to discuss his national role as the lead on health and safety for the NFCC, and that is scheduled in for sometime in November, that final meeting. I've saw an early draft of the report, and yeah, it has still got quite some way to go before it is ready for sharing, but we do hope to have that concluded in the first quarter of next year and have something to you for consideration. There will undoubtedly be recommendations within the high-rise report and within the health and safety report that will come either before yourselves or the Service Delivery Committee, Chair.
Okay.
The final one that we had scheduled for this year was the review of operational and protective equipment. Now, we had discussed this at a previous ARAC, and I'm aware that Assets had carried out an internal audit relating to operational equipment and have presented their findings to you. You asked about crossover between the two areas of audit at that time, and I was quite content that we would be looking at slightly different things. But the reality is, I think time has overtaken us on this one, and the commitment that we are placing on the ongoing work on high-rise and health and safety and finishing off COP26 and now moving on to the review of how we carry out local area inspections means that we will not be able to conclude this particular piece of work in the time frame that we had initially intimated. So I will be writing to the chair and the chief to advise them that this thematic will be removed from our annual planner, and it may be revisited in next year's planner, or it may well be one of those ones that we accept will come forward at some point in the future. And given that you already have the comfort from internal audit, then it's perhaps less of a priority than it was when it was first considered by my predecessor.
Yeah. Excellent.
That's the summary of my update, Chair. I'm happy to take any other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That's very helpful. I mean, we've had quite a discussion on your plans for local area inspections. So in terms of the rest of what Robert's covered, do we have any comments or questions for Robert? No, no, nothing from me either, Robert, other than to say I really do welcome this collaborative approach, which is evident through everything that you say and everything that you do, right from the operational level through to your engagement with committees and the board. I think it's fantastic that you're seeking to come along to a board strategy day and talk about stuff. From an audit committee's perspective, you know, we've mentioned earlier on today that it would be helpful for us to have a conversation separate to today around risk. But I mean, we can wrap up in that things to do with assurance as well, and just governance more generally, because I think it might be helpful in formulating your thinking to hear what we're thinking as an organisation and as a bunch of non-execs. So really thank you for that, and very much appreciate the openness of that approach. It's something that in recent times I don't think we've been accustomed to, so it's a breath of fresh air.
Thank you
Ross.
for the kind words, Chair, but it is a two-way street, and I would in return have to, thank and praise the SLT and the board for the manner in which I have been received and the manner in which you have engaged with me, because it is very much a two-way process, and I think we will be stronger if we work together, not in partnership, because obviously, as I said right at the outset, that would be inappropriate, but in forming that relationship, I think we'll get a stronger product at the end of that. So yeah, I'm very grateful for all the work that's been done by SLT and the board and all the time you have provided to me in my early stages of my new role.
Good. Okay, thank you for that. Ross.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for that update, Robert. Brian, you've said what I was going to say anyway, to be honest, but just on behalf of the executive, can I also acknowledge and thank Robert for the way that his staff are engaging with the service at the moment. And that's not just in terms of the formal work that you see coming before you. There's also a number of informal engagements going on between Robert's team and our teams here, and we very much welcome that approach as well, and that will absolutely bring value to what the service is trying to achieve. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross. That's excellent to hear. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross.
So that takes us to the end of the substantive agenda. The next item is review of actions. Heather, have you managed to pull together the actions?
Got potential for 6 actions.
Okay.
So these relate to item 7.1, the final report on remote working. Just to confirm with ICT colleagues the current situation around the multi-factor authentication, and that's against John Thompson. Moving on to item 7.2, the progress update internal audit recommendations. The committee have asked for some focus to be given around the recommendations where there are multiple date changes, and to report back to this committee in January, and that's against AZETS.
Okay.
Item 10, the draft anti-fraud and corruption policy. A copy of the terms of reference for the Good Governance Board to be circulated to committee members, and that's against Richard Fetton. Also under that item, we have the execs are to consider the wording used and include within the policy the chair of ARAC being briefed, and then also for the minute to record the policy going to the board for approval. And we've got that against David Johnston.
Okay.
Under item 11, draft risk management policy, building to the risk reporting for January, a specific update on progress of the alignment process for risk reporting, again against David Johnston.
Yeah.
And for item 12, the quarterly update of gifts, hospitality and interest register, we've got the chair and David Johnston to hold an off-table conversation, which will consider areas to be reported on at the January meeting to provide that broader assurance around additional actions being taken where interests are reported.
Okay, thank you. The only one I would add to that is Leslie's comments on the fraud policy about gross misconduct. And David was just going to take that away, check internally, and if necessary, adjust it, but it does need to be referred back to the committee.
Okay. Yeah, note.
Okay. Anyone picked up any others? No. Okay, thank you very much. We have the forward plan in your packs. Any comments or observations on the forward plan for the committee? No. Items to be considered at future integrated governance forum, board or strategy day meetings. Anything that's come up today that is worthy of being elevated to any of these forum? No. Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, the date of the next meeting is the 20th of January 2022, which sounds a long way away, but it's obviously not. So thank you very much to everyone for their contributions today. I'm not going to take a break now, but we do need to move into private session to consider the annual report and accounts. So Heather, I noticed in my appointment, our scheduled date time was just to run through to 4:30. So can we stay on this call?
No, we'll need to come out of this one, Brian, and go into the other link. But
okay, right,
that's
right.
okay for timing wise, yeah.
Right. So thanks again to everyone. We'll draw this meeting to a close, and if those who need to be in the private session can come back in immediately, that would be helpful. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.